we know nothing about ancient Jerusalem. So, this may surprise some people, but the fact of the matter is, when it comes to archaeology in Jerusalem, we know next to nothing. Now, I want to clarify what I say about this. We actually do know quite a bit about ancient Jerusalem from the 8th century BCE to the present. So 8th century, that's the time of that's the Iron 2B, starting the Iron 2C, where you're starting to see the reign of King Hezekiah. At this period, you have the famous Hezekiah. You have the famous bulle of King Hezekiah and the famous bulle of the prophet Isaiah. I remember walking in Jerusalem a few weeks back, seeing Dr. Yossi Garfinkel excavating and preparing for public display the ruins of the palace of the kings of Judah. That being said, prior to that time, we have nothing. And what's interesting about this is that even the atheists think something is missing, that something is being missed, and they don't see this as proof that the Bible is wrong. Watch the end and find out. So for starters, when it comes to archaeology in Jerusalem, the main problem is that it appears that Jerusalem was hardly ever destroyed. And so as a result, you have this large strata. So let me just explain how this works, how this would work in most areas of most archaeological sites. So in most archaeological sites, you would have a tell like this, and it was destroyed, it would be flattened. People just bury the houses, start a new layer, and build a new city. It would be destroyed again, bury a new layer, build a new city, and again, and again, and again. Jerusalem, however, actually from the time of King David, at least, to the time of until the time of the destruction of the Babylonians in 586 BC, was not destroyed even once. As a result, this makes it difficult to date things based on stratigraphy. There are other methods, however, of dating things. Notably olive pits, which can be carbon dated. Pottery finds that can be found at the last strata of houses. And there are some structures which can be dated in Jerusalem, notably famously the stone step structure, which is the foundation of a large palatial building that has houses on it. They're built on it from the 11th century, and has Canaanite terraces, potentially Canaanite terraces from the what we think would be the which would be the 11th. Sorry, that would be the 11th century. Getting mixed up, and the house would be from the 11th, meaning the stone structure was a structure built as a foundation for palace of the 10th century BCE, the time of King David. Which is why we know there was, in fact, it is widely accepted now that Jerusalem, at the time of King David, was the center of at least some sort of Davidic monarchy with King David as the head. There's also evidence from other archaeological sites of a Davidic kingdom. Certainly in Judah, potentially looking out at it in the north, but definitely in Judah, not even based on the Bible, on archaeology alone. We know that there was a Davidic dynasty based in Jerusalem, based on the foundation, based on the stone step structure, which, based on finds, has been dated to the 10th century BC, because there's a house on top of it from the 9th. Underneath it, there is Canaanite terraces from the 11th, which would put the foundation in the 10th, time of King David. We also know that there was a Davidic dynasty from inscriptions a few centuries later in Jerusalem. That, for example, the Caanan stele, which mentions the head of the house of Judah being the head of the house of David. So there was a Davidic dynasty, as well as common architectural styles of various cities, notably Kiryat Qeiyafa, surrounding what is probably the capital of Judah, namely Jerusalem, which appears to be the center of all this. That being said, for a capital of even if you're not a big defender of the Bible, even if you think that David was just like a small kingdom and only lived in Judah, that only existed in Judah, there's a lot of things that are lacking. So, for example, there's a lot of reason to suspect that the city of David may not have had a wall. So there's numerous reasons for this. So for many years, we thought there was a wall from the time of King David, or that dated from even the time of the Canaanites. Similar structure, similar style to Canaanite walls. But then they did some carbon testing. They found an undisturbed area. It was lined up with other strata, so we know it had not been undisturbed. And they dated the foundation, and they dated some organic material under the foundation walls, and they date to the 8th century, meaning that these huge city walls of Jerusalem date to the time of David, not to the time of David or Solomon, at least the ones we found, but to the time of Hezekiah. Furthermore, there is not a whole lot else we found in Jerusalem at the time. We have the Gihon Spring, we have the palace of what might be in my opinion probably the palace of David. We have the Gihon Spring, and that's really it from the time of David. Yet, what's interesting is that we cannot dismiss the fact that Jerusalem was a major city, and a power player at the time of David and the time of the pharaohs. And I'm not just talking about the Bible. So, for example, this is the reason why archaeologists are not saying that this disproves the Bible. Jerusalem was nothing. No archaeologists are really saying that, because even outside of the Bible, we actually have evidence of Jerusalem being a powerful city-state at the time of, say, Joshua. So, for example, the first king of Jerusalem that we have records for, to my knowledge, was called Abdi Kebda. It was essentially an Indo-European name. I know I've spoken to some people. I've had it suggest that maybe the Hittites mentioned in the land of Israel may have been related to Hittites, and that was just like a misnomer in the Bible. Kind of like how there's a lot of Canadians have some derogatory terms for southern neighbors, the Americans, and essentially anyone who's called from the United States, we call them Yanks in Canadian slang. Even if like a Yankee is technically someone from just like New England, strictly speaking, but we call Texans Yanks up in Canada. So something similar might be going on with the Israelites calling everyone who's Indo-European in Canaan a Hittite, for example. So we do have that, and we have records of his correspondence with the Pharaoh of Egypt from around the time of Moses. Apparently, his name was Abdi Kebda. Apparently, he said he was sitting in the house of his father, and he was ruling in Jerusalem, and he apparently been placed on the throne of Jerusalem by the Pharaoh, and he was asking for support. And we know from other correspondence that Jerusalem was one of the major kingdoms of Canaan at this time. It was the major player. It was essentially dominating the south of Canaan, while Shechem tended to dominate the north. This is basically mainstream archaeology from the Amarna letters. This cannot be ignored. Yet, guess what we found pretty well from Abdi Kebda's Jerusalem? Nothing. Not a single thing. Archaeologists said if we want to say that King David did not exist, then we really are going to have to say that Abdi Kebda didn't exist, because there's a lot more evidence for the kingdom of David, archaeologically speaking, than there is for Abdi Kebda, except for the fact we have these Amarna letters and this correspondence with the Pharaoh. So what appears to have so there are other problems. So why is this the case? So one, there were a lot of botched excavations early on in Jerusalem. That's one thing. So I remember McAllister, he would dig things up, find some nice sites, and he would just backfill them. So all the pottery we do in excavations in Jerusalem now is just all mixed up. Nothing against McAllister. That was just how archaeology was done at the time. Also again, as I mentioned before, there's not that many destruction layers to deal with. Also, there's another possibility, and this was brought up by one of my professors, that it appears that the people of Jerusalem, and this is also maybe the case with the Temple Mount as well, which there are some theories, like Israel Finkelstein, famous atheistic, minimalist biblical archaeologist, but he himself admits this is a problem. Like, we know Jerusalem was there. We know it was a city. We know it was a major power. There is enough evidence from the documents that were contemporary to this that Jerusalem at the time of David should have been it's a major power. What's going on? We need to explain this. And one of the things he suggested, I remember watching a podcast of his, is that it was probably all scraped off the Temple Mount, possibly other places in the city of David, and just shoved in the Kidron Valley as a garbage dump, which you can still see is still used as a trash dump today. And the Kidron Valley is something like 15 meters shallower now than it was back. It used to be far deeper by 15 meters. So throughout the centuries, may have been scraped off. Jerusalem may have been scraped off and just shoved into the Kidron. And that's where it is. And I've heard it suggested that maybe someday we could there should be excavations in the Kidron Valley itself to examine and look for things from the city of David there, and the city of ancient Jerusalem there. And again, this may be the case of the Temple Mount as well. So the result is, we know there was something in Jerusalem. There was palatial structures from the time of King David. We have that, but we don't have a whole lot else. We do not know for sure, and archaeologists debate this. I myself, personally, based on the text of the Bible, it mentions Solomon building the walls of Jerusalem. I think that at the time of David, Jerusalem was unfortified. So how do I reconcile this with the Bible speaking about it as a fortress? Well, Jerusalem is naturally a fortress on its own. Up until the time of King Hezekiah, the Kidron Valley is quite a steep slope. It would have been very easy to defend. Also, if you look at the city of David, similarly, that's another thing. There's also evidence of tunnels built by King Hezekiah, built in Canaanite times. The upper levels were built by Canaanites, and you can see where the Israelites later renovated them and made them shallower later on, if you go into them. But we just don't know. It was all scraped down, is what we think might be the case. But there's a lot of dispute. Again, there are multiple theories about whether or not there are walls. There's a lot of theories about whether or not Jerusalem was fortified or unfortified. There's a lot of debate about whether or not it was extended to or was mainly on what is currently the Temple Mount. That's a theory put forward by Israel Finkelstein, but others challenge it, because if you say the city of Jerusalem was all on the Temple Mount, great, it's fortified, but the water is quite a long ways away to get your water. And if there's an invasion, you're in big trouble. And so until the 8th century BCE, it is one of the biggest problems in Jerusalem. We don't have a lot of archaeology. There's some, but not a whole lot. It appears to have been... There was a palace there in the time of David. There was certainly administration going on there at the time of David. We know that from architecture. We know that from the architecture of the area, but a lot of things are missing. A lot of things appear to have just been scraped away. And that is the great mystery of Jerusalem, is what happened, or what was the Jerusalem prior to the 8th century BC? What did it look like? Was it fortified? Was it a unfortified hill village that had a lot of influence and power anyway. Think about even ancient Sparta. Remember reading classical sources that said if you went to ancient Sparta, you would think there were no monuments. It was just a village. Yet we know that Sparta was one of the most powerful city-states in ancient Greece, and that is a working theory for what we should think of Jerusalem as being prior to the time of King Hezekiah. It was a powerful kingdom, and that's the thing I want to emphasize. We know Jerusalem was a major power. We know it was the center of the Davidic kingdom. There is enough to confirm that there was, at the time of David, some major administrative work going on, some major palatial structures being built. The size of the stone step structure was a foundation for building that was the size of what up until that point would have been the size of a proto-Israelite village. Now, if you go there today and see it, you wouldn't think it's very big. It's like less than an acre. Proto-Israelite villages were tiny. Gonna say that right now. But we just don't know. We just don't know. So, based on the evidence I told you, comment down below. What do you think was happening in ancient Jerusalem? We know there was a Davidic Dynasty. That's a fact. We know it was centered in Jerusalem. We have enough evidence now to confirm that, thanks to research by Dr. Yossi Garfinkel and the palace that surrounded Jerusalem. And we know we know there's a palace in Jerusalem, or at least some sort of stone structure in the 10th century BC, and we know that there is a lot of evidence, there's a lot of evidence for a common architectural styles being used in city planning on the border of what would be the kingdom of Judah at the time of King David. We also know for a fact that at the time of Joshua, prior to him, at the time the Israelites were in Egypt, Jerusalem was a major political power in ancient Caanan. It was not a minor player. We know that from the Amarna letters. So these are all facts, yet we don't know so much. So comment down below what you think is going on, based on what I told you. Love to hear your thoughts. If I think it's a bad idea, I'll tell you why I think it's a bad idea. If I think it's a working idea, I'll tell you why as well. But I'd love to hear what everyone has to say. Anyway, God bless. Have a great day, and check out SSPX Church in real life if you get a chance. And yeah, tell me what you think happened to ancient Jerusalem prior to the 8th century BCE. God bless.